Good evening, everyone. It is so lovely to see so many faces in person here today, especially after more than 2 years of online events. My name is Simran Seiko, and I am a researcher here at the Social Inclusion Project, as well as your MC today. I'd like to welcome you to the launch of the Social Inclusion Project's latest report on homelessness in Singapore. Thank you for making the time to be here. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, homelessness has increased in many countries as unemployment, poverty, and eviction rates climbed. In Singapore, homeless shelters reached capacity at the start of the circuit breaker as public spaces became inaccessible and national borders closed. Within this context, in 2021, the research team that undertook Singapore's first nationwide homelessness street count before COVID-19 repeated the study to capture the state of homelessness in this exceptionally difficult time. The study report, which I co-authored with Dr. Ng Kok Ho, will be launched on the Social Inclusion Project's website later this evening. It is entitled Seeking Shelter: Homeless During the COVID-19 Pandemic in Singapore. The study this time is able to compare results from the latest street count of rough sleepers with findings from 2019. It also combines street, homeless, and shelter occupancy numbers to show, for the first time, a fuller picture of different forms of homelessness in Singapore. Finally, it identifies 3 categories of homeless persons based on in-depth interviews with shelter residents. The report presents all of these findings, considers the impact of the pandemic on housing insecurity, and reflects on lessons we may learn for tackling homelessness in the future. Today's event will begin with a presentation by Dr. Ng, who will take you through the study's key findings. We are also very honored to have with us Associate Professor Teo Yo Yen, who will provide comments and join us in the discussion with the audience later. First, the presentation. Dr. Ng Kok Ho is Senior Research Fellow and Head of the Social Inclusion Project, as well as the Case Study Unit here at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Dr. Ng, please.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for showing up. Special hello to all the volunteer field workers among you, especially those who are back for a second time. So I'll take about 30 to 40 minutes to run through highlights of the report from this year's study. So this is a report that will be launched, and it will be accessible for download to the public shortly after this. We'll give you instructions as to where to find it on our website later on. So I'll jump right into it. First, the background of this study. So the first thing to point out is, of course, that when we did this study last year, in 2021, it was year 2 of the COVID-19 pandemic. Right? That is the critical context of the second street count. We had 4 questions in mind that we hope to answer. One is, how has the level of homelessness changed since 2019? And of course, since then, it was a global pandemic. So we were curious to know how that has affected patterns of homelessness. The second question was, what were the causes and experiences of homelessness? And then we wanted to know how the pandemic altered the nature of housing insecurity in Singapore. And finally, we were interested in lessons that we might learn from this time. Those were the research questions. But in research about homelessness, the question we really are interested in is, how do we ensure adequate housing? Right? UN Habitat has a very precise definition for this. It means to live in security, peace, and dignity. Right? They helpfully also operationalize the concept of adequate housing into 3 dimensions. Security refers to secure tenure, exclusive occupation, and affordability. Adequate housing also refers to physical adequacy, so having the basic amenities, hygiene, safety, and space. And then there is the social dimension of adequacy, which refers to privacy, control over the use of the space, and an environment that is conducive to social relationships. So that is the larger goal in mind. This is, of course, not the first study on homelessness that we have conducted. This project, the larger project, actually started in 2017 when I was part of a group of social workers and researchers called SW101, and we partnered with an NGO called Montfort Care to conduct a selective single night count in 25 locations. And that year, we found, when we conducted that count, we found 180 rough sleepers. So that was reported in the media. 2 years later, we were prepared at that point to do a nationwide count. So that was the first nationwide street count with results published in November 2019. On hindsight, it was very timely because a few months after that, the pandemic struck. Right? And this was what happened. Right? We saw for the first time news that homeless shelters had reached capacity. And there was an unprecedented call at the time for businesses, NGOs, and private organizations to open up their premises because the facilities that were available no longer had space. That was in the circuit breaker period when pressure was the highest on services. But even near the end of 2020, there were still news reports expressing concern about shelter capacity. So this study took place kind of at the intersection of these two trends. Research had gained some ground in bringing to awareness the patterns of homelessness in Singapore, but at the same time, COVID-19 threatened to make homelessness worse. Right? So we were very curious what the situation was. How did we do the study? Here I thought it's useful to compare what we did in 2019 with what happened in the more recent study. Right? So in the first nationwide street count, some of you may remember, I'll explain these terms in a minute. We did the count in two ways. We did a cumulative count, and then we did a single night count. And those two counts produced two slightly different figures, which is why in reports about the findings we say it's 9212, 1050. So we produced a range. As part of that year's count in 2019, we also conducted a survey. Right? So those were the two elements of the first nationwide street count. As for the second nationwide street count, the one that we are reporting on today, it had three elements. The first was, again, a street count, but this time around we used the cumulative count method only, and I'll explain why in a moment. The second element was, for the first time, we were able to incorporate temporary shelter occupancy data. So the number of people living in temporary homeless shelters. Right? And the third component was in-depth interviews, as opposed to a survey using a structured questionnaire. So in-depth interviews. Let me briefly go through each of these components, why we did it, and how we went about it. So first, the street count. The first question when it comes to the conducting of the street count is to do a cumulative or single night count. The volunteers among you have heard me say this many times, so please bear with me. The main challenge with counting homeless people is that it's a mobile population. Right? So if you conduct a household survey, you can do it in stages because the household units are not moving anywhere. Right? But when you are counting a mobile population, to simplify it, two different things could happen. If your counters move from one zone to another, right? If the homeless person was moving opposite to the direction of your counters, you could miss them completely and undercount. On the other hand, if the homeless person was moving with your counters, you could be counting duplicates and therefore overcount. Right? So this is the main kind of methodological challenge. So when we first thought about this problem in 2019 and had to decide between doing a cumulative or a single night count, we didn't know which was better, so we did both. Right? So that was, as a first study, that was really useful. And one of the things it taught us was that the difference is not very big. Right? And when we analyzed the geographical distribution of homelessness using the two methods, the correlation was very strong. Right? Meaning that the same districts produce either high or low counts, no matter which method you used. But the two counts incurred very different kind of resources. Right? A cumulative count involves deploying volunteers in batches, and then they can do the count in their own time. Right? But to do a single night count means you gather everyone in one place, and then you deploy them all at once on a single night. Right? The purpose of doing this is so that if everybody does the count on one night, then you don't have this problem of duplicates or undercounting because you're everywhere all at once. But of course, you can't be everywhere at once. So single night counts are very consuming of resources, and we have to usually sample, right? Whereas cumulative counts, you can be geographically comprehensive, but you will take a period of time. Since the correlation was so strong, we decided that kind of the resources that it involved to organize a single night count didn't kind of warrant that little gain in the count returns. As you can see, I showed that photograph because it's clearly from a past era, right? So that was the night of the single night count, and you can see the clock. I mean, the screen is a little bit small, but those of you in front will see the time on the clock. It's 22:55. That was when the counters left this campus and started their count. There were several hundred people crowded into the LT at the time. It's a law LT. Clearly, we couldn't do this during 2021. So the pandemic is another reason it wasn't feasible to do this. Plus the resources it requires to organize that it wasn't necessary, right? Considering that both methods produce such similar results. So this time around, we did just the cumulative count method. We adopted the same definition of rough sleeping. This is important so that you can compare the results, right? So the definition must be held constant. So we told our counters, count anyone who is already asleep or going to sleep in public spaces. How do you know if someone is going to sleep? We had 3 criteria. They had some form of bedding. This could refer to a cardboard, a floor covering, some kind of enclosure, screen for privacy, or loose furniture, right? Or they had a lot of belongings, defined as a large bag or several bags or many plastic bags, or they were already lying down. So if someone met any one of the 3 criteria, they fall under the definition of going to sleep, they will be counted. So this was the same definition that we used in 2019. The UK's research on homelessness and rough sleeping also uses very similar criteria. In terms of the deployment, the map of Singapore is divided into 25 districts, 298 zones. What is a zone? A zone in residential neighborhoods is about 50 HDB blocks, or an area that would take 2 hours to cover on foot. Right? That's a zone. In all, we recruited more than 200 volunteers. All of them had to be trained, even if they did the count in 2019. Each volunteer was given 2 zones that they had to complete within 2 weeks, on any day, as long as they did not start before 11:30. And they were given strict instructions to do the count on foot. So no cycling, you can't be passenger in the car and then kind of just looking, because you may miss people, right, behind pillars and so on. So strictly on foot. We covered safety and ethics in our training, and we made everyone sign an undertaking of confidentiality to promise they wouldn't take any pictures or post on social media the locations of homeless persons they encountered. This is to protect people's privacy. Right. And then after all the entries were returned, our research team checked every entry twice to see that they did in fact match the criteria. Not all the entries did, we removed quite a number, just to make sure that it matched the definition. So that's the first component. The second component of the study is the shelter data. Right? Not much to say about this, except that shelter data is routinely included in homeless counts in many other places. Right? And during the pandemic, just now I showed you a couple of newspaper articles saying that the shelters reached capacity because many rough sleepers sought shelter during the pandemic. Right? So it was especially important this time to take shelter occupancy into account. Otherwise, we will present a very partial and possibly misleading picture of the state of homelessness. Right? And the Ministry of Social and Family Development kindly agreed to provide the data to allow us to do the analysis. The third component of the study was in-depth interviews. So these are qualitative interviews, fairly long, an hour usually to 1.5 hours. In qualitative interviewing, you have an interview guide. You don't follow it rigidly. Each conversation is different, and this flexibility allows the researcher to respond to each individual's circumstances and to the conversation. It is especially useful for understanding personal circumstances, complex housing histories, people's pathways into homelessness, and so on. In total, we interviewed 51 residents in temporary homeless shelters that were set up during the pandemic. And the profile of our interviewees, the participants, was similar to the general homeless population. So most of them were male, age 50 and above, single, divorced, or widowed. Most had no more than secondary education. They were Singapore citizens, and about 2/3 had rough sleeping experience, which means 1/3 did not. And this is important because if we were only surveying rough sleepers, we would not be able to also understand other forms of housing insecurity that did not lead to rough sleeping. Right? But when we speak to shelter residents, we get a broader mix. So that's the method. Now the findings. First, the street count and shelter data, which we must look at together, right, for the reasons I just explained. So what will we be looking at? These are the three elements of the study. First, cumulative street count, temporary shelter data, and in-depth interviews. They map quite nicely onto the three different types or levels of homelessness. So in homelessness research, we talk about primary, secondary, and tertiary homelessness. So primary homelessness is rough sleeping, right? Or sometimes we refer to this as street homelessness. So that's covered by the street count. Secondary homelessness refers to people in temporary and overnight shelters, and in the local context, transitional shelters that provide typically a 6-month stay, right? So fairly short term. That's secondary homelessness. That's covered by our temporary shelter data. Tertiary homelessness refers to people at risk of losing housing, maybe because of family violence, of difficulties affording rent or mortgage, or living in inadequate housing, such as the long-term shelters, welfare homes, and arguably even the public rental flats, right, for reasons I will say later, should be considered as inadequate housing. So tertiary homelessness doesn't map exactly onto the in-depth interviews, hence the broken line. But in the in-depth interviews with the shelter residents, in many of their housing histories, these things came up, right, living in situations where they were at risk of losing housing, and also experiences of public rental housing. Where it doesn't map exactly, we didn't have data on the long-term shelters. This is an area where I think we'll need more research in future. So the data I'm going to show you next is a combination of primary and secondary homelessness, right? So street count and temporary shelter data. And these are the headlines. Right? So two main headlines from this year's count. First is that there was no significant change in the total scale of homelessness between 2019 and 2021, despite intense state intervention and a global pandemic. Right? So the combined street homeless and temporary shelter count fell from 1,115 to 1,036. Right? So it's a fall of 79, just around 7% fall. Right? A gentle decline, no significant change in the total scale of the problem. But the form of homelessness did change. Right? So we can see this in two ways. First, there was a sharp fall in street homelessness, so primary homelessness, which fell from 1,050 in 2019 to 616. So there's a sharp fall of around 41%. Street homelessness, rough sleeping. This was kind of compensated, right, if I can say that, by a surge in shelter occupancy. So a surge in secondary homelessness from 65 in 2019 to 420, which is an increase of 546%, which is a number that doesn't make sense. I should just say it was an increase of more than 6 times, right? So a huge increase, huge fall in street homelessness, huge rise in shelter occupancy, right? So in chart form, this is what it looks like. So all this is, of course, taken from the report, which you can access at a later time. I'll just narrate. Okay, the dark blue segment, these are shelter numbers, temporary homeless shelter occupancy numbers. Right, you can see a sharp rise here. That was the circuit breaker right? Which coincided with many NGOs and religious groups responding to the government's call to provide shelter space within their premises. So a sharp rise in the circuit breaker period continued to rise, and then as people exited the shelters, a gentle fall. Right? So that's a general pattern. The grey segments, those are the street counts. That's why we only have 2 data points, because this is a 2019 street count that we first conducted, and then this is the 2021 street count that we are presenting today. Right? So sharp fall, you can see the grey segment shrinking, and then the blue bars kind of making up for it. Right? Total numbers, not a huge change if you look at the height of the bars. Right? There's some kind of there's a lot of detail in what the numbers represent and so on, which I encourage you to read in the report. I won't be able to talk about it here because of time, but that's the general picture. Okay? Those are the headlines. In terms of the map, right, this is what it looks like now. Right? 2021, distribution of street homelessness. This is a heat map, but you will notice that there's mainly only one shade of red, and then 2 segments of pink. Right? It doesn't mean that all the white areas are 0, but 0 to 10, when there are up to 10 homeless persons found in that sector, the segment is white. So quite fairly wide distribution, but monotone, right? So most of it, we no longer have the situation in 2019, which looked like this. So this is a 2019 map. You can see the clear, just kind of the color difference, right? The intense red in the downtown area is gone, and then the second belt around the downtown area of still fairly high counts, that is gone. Now most of the zones are this color, right? So that of course captures the 40% fall, right, in street homelessness. So that's what it looks like in map form. So focusing on the street count now, right? Just now was shelter and street data. Now focusing on the street count specifically, despite the sharp fall in numbers, 41% fall, we noticed that the pattern and profile of street homelessness, interestingly, was very, very stable. Right? So huge fall in absolute numbers, but very little change otherwise. Right? Most of the rough sleepers we found were still older Chinese men, right? Only 12% women. I can show you here the gender breakdown. On the left, 2019, on the right, 2021. Even from the back, you can see that they look fairly similar, right? Just the segmentation. Just a few percentage points different in terms of gender breakdown. In terms of correlation by district, again, very similar. So total numbers fell, but the high count districts in 2019 are still the high count districts in the study this time around. Right? And the same pattern that we observed in the last time, which is that there were higher numbers in larger, older, and poorer neighborhoods, again, we noticed this time. So, like I said, very stable in terms of the general profile. Right? And this shows the correlation between the 2 counts. Right? Vertical axis, 2019 count, horizontal axis, 2021 count, and the straight line through shows the correlation. You can see how tightly the dots are clustered around the line. Right? High count districts still high. 2 years later, low count districts still low. Right? So to give some of these places a name, I've just cut off the top of the table to show you some of the highest count districts. And this is the only aspect where there was an obvious deviation from the 2019 count, which was a deconcentration from the city to residential neighborhoods. Right? So in both years, you can see that the city area, city district, still turn in the highest numbers. Of course, the absolute numbers have fallen because the total has fallen, so it fell across the board. But even then, the fall in the city district was larger than the fall elsewhere. So in terms of proportion, the share of counts within the city district fell from 23% to just 12%. And then that share was redistributed to the residential neighborhood. So small climbs in terms of percentage everywhere else, a big fall in the city district in terms of percentage. right? There were only a few exceptions where, despite a 40% fall in total number, the absolute number in a few neighborhoods actually went up, Queenstown being the most prominent. Just 9 in 2019 to 26 this time around. Right? That was the area where there was the most kind of the result really stands out. So that's the overall picture in terms of the numerical results. A partial replacement of primary homelessness by secondary homelessness, meaning moving off the streets into shelters. Total scale of homelessness fairly stable. Right? The profile and pattern of the street count itself remarkably stable, aside from a deconcentration from the city. Right? It's not easy to explain why. We can only suggest kind of guesses. And I think it may have something to do with people retreating from those places that are more exposed to public view in a pandemic. But really, that's just our best guess. Right? So that's the numerical results. What about the in-depth interviews? From interviewing the 51 shelter residents, we identified 3 groups of homeless persons. And we refer to them as long-term homeless persons, newly homeless persons, and transnational homeless persons. Right? In this table, I just kind of summarize their key profiles and circumstances. And although I present them as 3 columns, I must say that the differences between them are in terms of shades rather than colors. Right? So the overall kind of the picture and the pathways of how they entered into homelessness and their housing insecurity, the major drivers of housing insecurity are similar for all 3 groups, right? But there are slight variations in terms of their housing histories, right? So I'll explain what I mean. If you look at the long-term homeless group, these are shelter residents who had experience of rough sleeping even before the pandemic. Right? So there were more men than women. In terms of family relationships, many of them were estranged from their family. Some had not spoken to family members for decades. Economically, many were in insecure work and were in extreme poverty. Right? And they were found during the pandemic while they were rough sleeping. Right? Then the newly homeless group refers to shelter residents who had no experience of rough sleeping before the pandemic. Here there was a mix of men and women. Again, there were strained relationships with the family, but they were not, the conflict was not to the degree that we saw with the long-term homeless group. Economically, very similar, insecure work, in-work poverty, and during the pandemic, they referred themselves to the shelters. They sought help voluntarily. Right? Third group, transnational homeless persons. This group maybe stands slightly apart from the first 2. They were almost all men. Right? So these are Singaporeans who usually lived in Malaysia or Indonesia. But because of border closures during COVID, they couldn't stay there anymore because they were on social visit passes that only were good for 30 days. So they will be overstaying if they remain in Malaysia and couldn't leave after a certain date because the borders on both sides closed. Right? So they came back to Singapore. Before the pandemic, they were frequent commuters. They traveled to Singapore for work. Some of them did that daily, some weekly, a few monthly. Right? So that was their routine. They lived in Malaysia or Indonesia, came to Singapore for work, or to renew their visas, or in their language, to chop passport. Right? We know what they mean. Right? And the work that they did in Singapore, in that respect, very similar to the other 2 groups, low-wage work, low-wage, insecure work. Some already had experiences of rough sleeping before the pandemic, sometimes when they missed the ferry home. Right? They have no housing here, right? Because their home is elsewhere. They are only here for work. So if for any reason there was a disruption of their commuting routines, some of them ended up homeless. Their route to the shelter was that they were stopped at immigration and directed to the shelters. So slightly different pathways. I would just flag that in terms of housing histories, that is where we see the clearest divergence. The long-term homeless persons, many of them had experiences of public rental housing and very poor experiences in the public rental housing system. They encountered barriers to accessing such housing or found that they had to leave after a while, right, because it wasn't adequate. The second group, newly homeless persons, they were more likely to depend on friends and family for shelter and also low-cost open market rentals, so normally a bedroom in a HDB flat. Right? The third group I have mentioned, they don't have housing in Singapore, their routine was to commute. Right? So in terms of housing histories, that's where we see the clearest divergence. This is the longest part of the report, right? Qualitative analysis just needs more words. So here I'll just give you some of the highlights. In terms of family situation, I mentioned commonalities across. There was often a history of conflict, a very bitter conflict leading often to marital breakdown, and the impact on housing is, of course, that as the marriage breaks down, they also lose the matrimonial home. Not all of them get divorced formally, but it does mean that they had to leave the family home and could no longer return. As many of the interviews spoke about their family histories and about conflicts, sometimes that stretches back decades, it was still clear that these were very traumatic experiences. And they made it very clear that it was irreversible. Right? So it's not a matter of just return home, right? They were very clear it's irreversible. So here's a quote. This is a 49-year-old man who explained how he lost a 24-year job as a bus maintenance technician after his divorce. He said, after I divorced, I'm depressed. Then after that, I got so many problems. Work problem, financial problem. Then after that, I have to give the house to my ex-wife in exchange for my kids' maintenance. Because I cannot do anything already, I distress. Work also cannot cope. From there, I've been forced to resign. Then starting from there, I went down. Economically, precarity was the common trend for all three groups. Insecure work as well as in-work poverty. So people who were working but still poor because the jobs paid too little or jobs were not always available. So these were casual on-call work, for example. Many of them had long work histories but full of low-wage short-term jobs. These are occupations we are now familiar with and associate with paying low wages, cleaning, security. There were some technicians, some people in service lines. They tend to refer to their work as ad hoc or freelance, right? So they'll hire on a casual basis, and many of them experience extreme poverty. In this conversation, we asked them, because they were describing their income situation, so we asked them, what do you mainly cut back on if money is not enough? And Mahia, a 39-year-old woman, said, basically, like food. I cut back a lot on food. I don't splurge anyhow. Basically, essential things like your toiletries, like you want to purchase, never mind, this one can wait, this one can wait. You keep on telling yourself that most of the time. Sometimes like you are really very hungry, you just ignore your hunger because you have no money. I mentioned 2/3 of the interviewees had experiences of rough sleeping, and this was hard, right, as they described their experiences. And often, rough sleeping was long-term. The shortest was 3 months. The longest was 25 years of rough sleeping. So washing was a constant challenge, all sorts of basic needs, finding a place to wash, holding on to their belongings, which are often stolen, encounters with enforcement officers. And the choice of location is a critical thing for rough sleepers. And there's this trade-off between safety and trying to avoid checks by enforcement officers, right? More isolated, kind of darker places, you probably won't be checked, but it means you feel less safe. So these were the kind of things that we're thinking about. Rahim, a 65-year-old man who had been sleeping around for 12 years, said, sleep outside, mosquitoes, rats, cockroaches, disturbing. So not enough sleep. Sometimes 1 hour I woke up, 2 hours I woke up. So sleep disturbance was a very common theme in their descriptions, and this went on for 12 years. Another account, because he was talking about being hungry all the time while rough sleeping. So we asked, how did you get your food? He said, I just like coffee shop, see got leftovers, then eat. Just little sit down, or McDonald's, Burger King, just see if got leftover food, then just sit down, pretend to sit, then just take like that. Right? I remember when he was talking about this, he felt a bit embarrassed. Right? So to have to, then he later on said that that's just what you have to do because you have no choice. Then housing instability. This was another commonality across the groups. Public rental housing, right? HDB's public rental housing really stood out. Repeated accounts of especially poor experiences in the joint singles scheme. So this is a scheme where single persons, to access public rental housing, they are required to pair up and share a one-room flat. One-room flat is our terminology, right? Local terminology. Actually means a studio flat with no bedrooms. So 2 single applicants have to share one such flat. Within HDB's public rental housing system, it's about 35 square meters, just enough to fit 2 beds, 1 table, maybe a small wardrobe. So what are the problems? People spoke about how they couldn't find a partner. And some kind of irrationalities in the system. For example, even if they found a partner that was usually completely unrelated, their applications were assessed jointly. Right? So the income limit of $1,500 applies to the 2 applicants, even though they are completely unrelated and do not share household expenses. Right? The income limit of $1,500 has also not been renewed since 2003, just 19 years ago. Right? In the context of today's rapid inflation, I think we have a sense of how far behind it is lagging behind actual living standards. And the main problem is, of course, that when you make 2 people live together who are not related, and there's not enough space for them to have privacy, there's a lot of conflict. Eventually, people figure out that it doesn't work, and then they move out, and they end up on the streets. Right, so this was a common trend. One of the interviewees I recall tried to explain to us how he tried to make it work, that initially he would take long bus rides at night, because he just couldn't be in a flat with his co-tenant at the same time. So instead of sleeping, he would take long night bus rides to avoid being at home when the flatmate was at home. But then he had no energy for work the next day, and he later lost his job. If not public rental housing, what other options? Some people depended on family and friends. So this was dependent on people's goodwill. And it doesn't come free. So they told us that often you also have to pay a contribution, but it's a bit cheaper than rent outside. If you can't afford to pay a little bit of rent, you have to help with the household chores. And again, there was often friction, and when things broke down, the arrangement could end quite abruptly. And then people find themselves with no shelter. The third option was open market rentals, room in a HDB flat. This was quite expensive, considering that most people earn around $1,000 a month. They reported paying rents of around $500 to $800, which is a sizable chunk of a very low income. And people also recounted many problems with landlords. Those of you who are renting will be familiar with this. Landlords will say you can't use the kitchen or can't use the washing machine, who refuse to fix the shower, a broken shower, or impose a curfew or demanded advance rent and so on. One interviewee said, if they want you to move, they will find ways to make you uncomfortable. Right? So that was the nature of the insecurity in the open market. Otherwise, sometimes people resorted to makeshift arrangements. One interviewee was an unregistered tenant in a HDB flat, which is actually not allowed. Another family of 4 had to be separated. The father lived in Johor, but worked in Singapore, so he commuted. Right? Living in Johor is cheaper. The wife lived on employer-provided accommodation in Singapore. They have 2 sons. The elder son is renting a room himself. The younger son is in NS. So there's accommodation taken care of, but he can't book out. Right? So during the interview, he said, the 4 of us have to live apart, and I just want a flat where we can all be together. So this sort of makeshift arrangement. So of course, the father was in the shelter. That was why we ended up talking to him. The transnational homeless group was a bit special, I mentioned earlier. They made frequent commutes to Singapore, did low-wage jobs, and for those who didn't return home every day, or sometimes miss the transport back home, when they were in Singapore, they had to spend the night here, they would sleep outside, sleep rough, or sleep at their workplaces to save money, because low-wage jobs. But the issue was also that some of their difficulties had kind of institutional basis, right? Because they were social visit pass holders, they were not eligible to work or purchase housing in Malaysia or Indonesia. But when they're in Singapore, they are also not eligible for HDB rental flats together with the spouse, unless the spouse was PR. Otherwise, they fall under the joint single scheme, right? Which doesn't work because the spouse then cannot live together with them and a stranger. And of course, after border closures, they were stranded and homeless here. Ever since we published a report from the 2019 study, I was often asked this question, which is, why are there so few women who are homeless? Which is a difficult question to answer. I mean, it's very hard to comment on what didn't happen, right? It's a counterfactual. So this time around, because among the interviewees there was a small group of women, we were able finally to begin to think about this question of gender and homelessness. And this quote, I think, captures it very well. One of the interviewees said, "I'm a woman, I can't be out on the streets." Right? So consistently, women were far less likely than the men to sleep rough. Right? Some of them avoided it at all costs. Instead, they depended on family and friends. Right? So it's a different kind of insecurity. It was not rough sleeping. And during the pandemic, they sought help directly from public agencies. But for the few who did sleep rough, we noticed differences in the choice of location. They tended to sleep in enclosed spaces. So, for example, a 24-hour fast food restaurant or a cafe or a shopping complex where there was security officers or people working, right, brightly lit. They were less likely to be in groups. So some rough sleepers are in groups, mainly because I think other rough sleepers are going to be men, right, chances are. So they tend to be alone. And I must stress this, I mean, rough sleeping was difficult for anyone, men and women alike, right? But with some of the men who had long-term histories of rough sleeping, they spoke about it in a matter-of-fact way, but none of the women did, right? They just never got used to it, right? If one can get used to such things. So this quote, every night I go to a different block to sleep because for safetiness. Because if I always sleep at the same garden every night, if someone saw me, if the bad guy saw me, they would do something, right? That's a woman who had been rough sleeping for 3 years. She has to change location every night. Okay, so to wrap up, key findings. This was the first time we were able to produce a fuller picture of primary and secondary homelessness. And what that picture tells us is that between 2019 and 2021, the scale of homelessness had not changed significantly. But primary homelessness had been partially replaced by secondary homelessness. In terms of street homelessness, the patterns and profile are quite stable. I think it shows us that we have not significantly altered the landscape of rough sleeping in Singapore, despite the scale of intervention, so there's still work to be done. Right? The pandemic clearly triggered people's admission into the shelter, but it was not the dominant cause of homelessness. The drivers that I mentioned, right, the drivers of housing insecurity, a breakdown in social relationships, economic precarity, the lack of adequate housing options, none of those were due to the pandemic, right? So they were long-standing problems. So what do we recommend? First, a whole-of-government approach. Right? Whole of government approach. At the front lines, the mobilization and coordination of frontline agencies, such as the police, NParks, and so on, to make the identification and reaching out to homeless people part of regular practice. And then there are agencies like SSOs and hospitals that already have a social mandate, but which may not relate to housing. So it is for them to be more proactive in identifying homeless people. And then we, of course, have agencies like family service centers that already have social work expertise and are familiar with homelessness issues. They often do a lot of advocacy that is not responded to by public agencies. I've done a bit of research on that with a colleague, Niu Yu Wei. So in that respect, it's mainly for agencies to listen to the cases that need help. And if homelessness has to do with economic precarity, we have to continue to think about wage standards and to improve the generosity of financial assistance. I think it's important to remember that whenever we debate the adequacy of financial assistance, we must remember there is a cost, right? And one of the costs of ungenerous assistance is homelessness. The HDB public rental housing policy, I've already discussed it. I cannot put it more plainly than this, right? HDB's public rental housing policy contributes directly to homelessness. The evidence is very, very clear, right? And so it must be reformed. This is something that's been periodically brought up by MPs in Parliament as well. and it's an issue I think that warrants our attention. Exits from homelessness will always require accessible and adequate housing. There is no way around this. And in a home-owning society, for people who can't afford to buy housing, public rental housing will always be the last safety net. Right? So what do we need to do differently? We need to ensure space and privacy standards are met. So the requirement for singles to share a flat must end. Income eligibility rules need to be fairer. They need to be updated to reflect actual living standards. And I would strongly recommend that homelessness be added to the list of criteria to qualify for public rental housing. Finally, we turn to research. I've always said street counts, studies like street counts should be conducted regularly, right, so that you can monitor the situation. And if so, responsibility for such work must one day pass to public agencies. Right? But research done by independent researchers is not the same as research done by government agencies, especially as in Singapore, I think we still do not have a regular practice of always publishing research done by the government. So it's important to set standards, and I suggest 3. The first is rigor. This means always using the best available expertise and using robust research methods. There must be independence. This can be done in many ways. For example, appointing an advisory panel with diverse views. And importantly, not just asking public employees to do the fieldwork, but involving members of the public. Right? And finally, transparency. Right? Definitions and processes must be documented. And of course, it must be published. It leaves me now to thank some people. This study could not have been possible without the generous funding and encouragement of the Community Foundation of Singapore. We're very grateful to the shelter residents who shared with us their deeply personal stories in the interviews. We are, of course, very indebted to our volunteer field workers. Every time we issue a call for volunteers, I will tell my team, I don't know who will sign up. What if nobody signs up? Doesn't mean we have to do everything ourselves. But each time volunteers have responded to the call, some of them have returned the second time. Thank you for your kindness and your generosity. This study has been very lucky to have excellent research assistants. I'm especially grateful to Terence and Kelvin, who have been with the study for their entire undergraduate careers, and they have finally graduated. So thank you for your incredible stamina. I'm also very grateful to Wen Yue for producing the maps, Huda for help with the Malay interviews. Of course, thank you to MSF for sharing the data. Well done, that's the way to go. And thank you, Vanessa, for your excellent work with report design. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Ng. I'd now like to invite Associate Professor Teo Yo Yen, the discussant for today's event, on stage. Professor Teo is Provost Chair and Head of Sociology at the Nanyang Technological University. Her research focuses on poverty and inequality, governance and state-society dynamics, gender, and class. She's the author of 2 books, Neoliberal Morality in Singapore, How Family Policies Make State and Society, and This is What Inequality Looks Like. Please welcome her to the stage.
Thank you. It's great to see everybody and to see so many familiar faces. And thank you, Kok Ho and Simran, for the opportunity to preview this excellent report and to comment on it today. So I will first highlight some significant contributions the report makes, and then briefly discuss its implications for where we go next. Let me begin with drawing the audience's attention to the report's contributions. First, I want to point out that before Kok Ho decided to do this research to understand homelessness in Singapore, there was no comprehensive data about how many people are sleeping rough in Singapore and why and how they are in this situation of extreme housing insecurity. Kok Ho's pioneering work has radically transformed what we know about homelessness in Singapore. He has put on the agenda that to understand homelessness, we must take into account people who are sleeping rough, not just people in shelters or institutions, and also regardless of their official housing status. Through this work, we've also become alert to the idea that to understand homelessness, we must hear from homeless people their accounts of their lives and experiences. And from here on, I think these will be no-brainers. This is obviously how we must conceptualize, account for, and try to understand homelessness. But please note and remember that this was a gaping data void before Kok Ho's work. Second, Kok Ho and team have developed a robust methodology for identifying and recording homelessness. And this is no small feat. Homelessness is stigmatized, it is hidden from view, it's geographically spread out, and it's somewhat mobile, as he's explained. And the methodological challenges of studying it are twofold. On one side are all the typical dilemmas of social science research. How to operationalize homelessness as a concept, how to sample sites where people might be sleeping rough, how to think about ethical obligations to subjects who occupy very marginal spaces in society. A second layer of challenges go beyond most social science research because a comprehensive count of homeless persons requires large numbers of volunteers who are not trained researchers. So how did Kok Ho approach these challenges? From an initial single night limited site street count in 2017 to a comprehensive island-wide street count in 2019, and to the current report's inclusion of persons sleeping rough, as well as persons in shelters. Kok Ho was able to test and improve on various strategies for locating, identifying, and accurately recording the number of people in Singapore who do not have adequate shelter or housing security. Furthermore, he developed rigorous procedures for educating and empowering volunteers and ensuring the return of robust and accurate data. I highly recommend everybody read the methodology sections of both the 2022 and 2019 reports. They are superb models for how to develop research practices that are clear in purpose, that ensure high-quality data, that embed consistent ethical habits, and that galvanize the work of teams. All future work on homelessness in Singapore will have the benefit of this work having been done and the benefit of systematic and transparent recording of how the conceptual and empirical labor came about. So all future work must now be measured against this very high standard. Now, apart from capturing the numbers of people facing housing insecurity, the research also makes a very important contribution in collecting data about the dynamics and the causes of homelessness. The report, through very nuanced analyses of survey in the first report and then in the second report, interview data, Kok Ho and his team do two important things. First, they identify the conditions that are necessary for attaining housing security. This may sound very simple, but in a context where we regularly presume that housing is accessible to everyone and that housing insecurity is a rare problem, we often overlook the many conditions that need to be in place for housing needs to be met. These include regular work and predictable income, financial buffers, social interdependence, and familial stability. And as their analyses show, breaks to any of these components can create crises situations that are very difficult to repair. A second thing that the team does with interview and survey data is this. They identify important variations among the homeless population. The 2022 report in particular highlights the particular challenges faced by transnational families during the pandemic, as well as homeless women. And in identifying variant pathways leading to housing insecurity, as well as to variant experiences in homelessness, the report allows us to see the range of social conditions that matter for understanding homelessness. These include immigration policies and housing policies, and work conditions and wage regimes, and societal values and norms. With these insights, There is no backsliding to individualistic accounts and lame claims that things can only be resolved case by case. Here is evidence of the importance of structure, of rules, regulations, and social conditions that shape individuals' options and lives. If problems are structural, solutions too must be. As Singapore gradually resumes normality after 2.5 years of the pandemic, it's more important than ever to keep these variations in experiences and conditions in mind, because the resumption to normal is otherwise likely to be highly uneven. So to sum up the contributions of the work are in agenda setting, in the design and execution of rigorous methodology, and in the identification of key social forces. What are some implications for these contributions, for what happens next? First, the report itself directly and explicitly points to policy areas and social service practices that can be improved or transformed. In providing empirical data and theoretical analysis, the work gives policymakers and practitioners in the social service sector concrete materials to work with as they imagine and craft better solutions to improve housing security and to prevent housing insecurity. Social service practices, housing policies, wage policies, health and public assistance, data collection and further research. The study's findings are useful for rethinking what can be done at multiple sites. With the bleak and urgent problems we face today, it can often seem like things are at a stalemate and positive changes are hard. The social sciences, whether economics or sociology or public policy, are fundamentally oriented toward identifying and understanding problems on the one hand, and imagining ways of improving on human well-being and flourishing on the other hand. For the second part, the work of imagination, to proceed, empirical evidence of alternatives and possibilities are crucial. The homelessness report captured what happened during the COVID-19 circuit breaker in 2020, in which, although people faced new and intense challenges, the high priority placed on sheltering people also led to expansion of shelter spaces and reduction in rough sleeping. This evidence of what can be achieved when something is prioritized indicates a range of possibilities for resolving housing insecurity. It gives us a glimpse then not just of how the problem of homelessness manifests, but also that it's a problem whose scale indicates immediate possibilities of resolution if it is prioritized. Third, and relatedly, in placing this report in the public realm, in modeling rigor, independence, and transparency, Kok Ho and his research team, including the hundreds of volunteers who've taken part in this work, have demonstrated that placing research in the public consciousness, raising awareness about social problems, is an important part of making a problem a priority. So moving forward, the public, or various publics, civil society, journalists, students, social workers, academics, etc., have to continue the work of ensuring that housing needs, housing security and insecurity in its many forms, and poverty and inequality more generally, remain something we care about and a high public priority. So with that, thanks and congratulations again to Kok Ho and Simran for this wonderful report. And I encourage everybody to read the whole report in its entirety. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Teo. We now have some time for questions and discussion. As Dr. Ng and Professor Teo take their seats, which they have already done, I would just like to point out that there are 3 microphones, 1 in this aisle and 2 in the aisle to the left of me. So if you have a question, can I please ask you to go to any one of those microphones, tell us your name and organization, and state your question. And in the interest of getting through as many questions as possible within the limited time that we have, we'd appreciate if you could please be concise in asking your question. And I will now hand over to our speakers for the Q&A segment.
Thank you very much, Simran. I see we already have one.
Hi, Prof. Hi, Prof. Kok Ho, and hi, Prof. Teo Yuen. Thank you for the presentation. It was wonderful to be able to participate in this research I think I was a policy student at that time. It was interesting to see it, but I'll be quick and get to the question. When you think of handing this over to public agencies to the count, and I wonder if you've seen it already in 2019 to 2022, is there's also a risk of further invisibilizing the population, right? I'm sure there's been tremendous improvements in terms of designing things that are anti-homeless, like bars on benches, lights prominently, more cameras and things like that. Do you see that as a tension, that whereas there's a point of time where the counts are going to reduce while the population remains more transient, rather than the fundamental issues being solved, especially when it gets handed over to public agencies, wherein more details around where the people are found can be used by HDB in their decisions to further add measures, to reduce the spots rather than help the people become homed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Prof, and hi, Dr. Ng. I'm Gabriel. I'm a PhD student here. So my question pertains to the locations of the shelters. Do you have these locations, and would it be possible that you see decreases in some zones because they have a higher concentration of shelters?
Hi, so I'm Abhishek. I'm here from the Lee Kuan Yew School. So in listening to everything that you had to say in the brief amount of time, I sensed that so even in the case of Rahim, he's been sleeping, rough sleeping for at least 25 years now. But maybe because of the paucity of time you weren't able to mention, but I did not see any government support or solution coming in those 25 years to actually remedy his situation. And then the stark fact that such a study has not been done till 2022. So why have public agencies given a blind eye to this issue? And basically coming down to the very simple question is how does the Singapore government look at the homeless in Singapore, given that they are citizens and lacking social safety net, social protection, access to healthcare and all those basic essences? So how does the government actually look at the homeless? Why has there been a blind eye in all those years, and why does it take so long to do such essential research? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hello, I'm Sing Wei from Children's Society. So the first question is that when the counts were picking up females we are picking up females homeless from street counts, are we also picking up families that are out in the streets? And for the females out there, what is the prevalence, and is there sufficient support for female singles who are homeless? Then my next question is that after your first study in 2019, then last year there's also a major media coverage on homelessness in Singapore. Just wondering whether is there any shift in public sentiment about supporting the homeless, and are people right now more receptive about supporting them, or there is still a moral hazard about providing too comfortable support for this group of people? Yeah, thank you.
Let me pick the easier ones first. Second question was about shelter locations. So, unfortunately, we're not able to divulge the shelter locations. We are quite protective of the data, and the volunteers would know why we explain this. Because as I think one of the questions pointed out, there still remains a legislation, the Destitute Persons Act, that allows the involuntary institutionalization of homeless people. The government has given explicit assurances that is not their first resort, it is the last, right? But nonetheless, the legislation remains, right? So, and as long as that is the case, we can't risk it. So we don't divulge identities, locations, and so on. But I must say, I think that the intention behind your question is whether the locations of the shelters are absorbing the homeless persons in the vicinity. I would say fairly certainly that's not the case, especially during the pandemic. I mean, shelter capacity was so short that wherever there was space, people would be put inside. They weren't picking locations close to where they are, right? But I kind of get the line of thinking. The first question was interesting. It was about the passing the study over to the state. And I think you make the interesting observation, something that I've mentioned in the report, which is that we keep saying the government, right? But the government is a humongous organization, or a collection of many entities. And different parts of government have very different stakes in this issue. And not all of it is related to housing security, right? So you are right that sometimes different parts of governments have kind of objectives that run at cross purposes. So that is, I think, an issue, right? Which is why we flagged it in the report. So what can we do about it? I think then it's up to the public, right, and concerned groups and NGOs, advocates, of course also researchers, right, to keep steering the issue in the direction in which we are concerned about. Right? Of course, from my perspective, it's housing security, and if there are other groups, NGOs and so on who share the same interest, then you must make yourselves heard, right, so that the department that defends that interest can act with the full force of your concern and your support, right? So that's what I'll say regarding public agencies and mandates. Abhishek's question, I wouldn't say that the government has turned a blind eye. After all, I did say that they can involuntarily institutionalize people. So it's not true that the government has turned a blind eye. In fact, in the report, I described how I think the policy stance has softened in the last few years. I think thanks to public concern and public awareness, the policy stance, because we study what policymakers say in public and in parliament, it has really, the position has softened, right? And we see this, the most concerted effort in terms of stepping up services and coordination of outreach. There has been a massive effort. And the expansion of shelter capacity during the circuit breaker is nothing short of a feat. Right, so within the short space of time. So Yuyen's point about when something is a priority, what a difference it can make, right? So not a blind eye, but I think the emphasis has shifted. There's more openness to talk about the issue, and I think that is evidence of how important it is to again make yourselves heard and keep up the pressure. Why did they take so long before they want to think about studying the issue? I mean, so the question, why did we have to do the study, right? And how does the government look at homelessness? I don't think I can answer the question because I'm not government. I know there are colleagues here from MSF, but we will not put you on the spot. So I think that question has to be posed to government. Why did it take you so long to decide to study the issue? I can't answer that question. Singwei's question about families, very straightforward. No, we did not encounter any families in the count. That was also the case. I think maybe there was one family in the 2019 count, but vast majority, all single persons. Women's percentage, 12%, this time around, 12%. 2019, about 10%, so fairly stable. Has public sentiment changed? I would say yes. I mean, we haven't done a sentiment study, right, or public opinion poll. But I say yes because of kind of the outpouring of public concern when NGOs called for help and resources and so on. And a good gauge is always kind of the column inches devoted to the issue in our mainstream media. And as you've noticed, it was a huge issue during the circuit breaker. That means journalists know that the public is concerned as well. I would say public sentiment has shifted. Yeah. Anything you want to add?
I would just add that when I recall when you first started this study, that you were very concerned that in encountering persons who are sleeping rough, right, that they might mistake the researchers for public. For public enforcement officers, etc., right? And because of the existence of the Destitution Persons Act, that there was a real risk, and as a researcher, you are also mindful of putting them at some risk by doing the work. And I think that is important moving forward if this work is to be done by public agencies, right? That protection of the persons being studied needs to be maintained in significant ways. And that's a real concern moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I should have mentioned that. In the 2019 count, we went out to kind of to negotiate partnerships with NGOs. In the end, we worked with more than 20 NGOs. We had to persuade each one of them, and I remember one of them, the most experienced in the area of homelessness outreach. We were speaking to their volunteers. So remember, a lot of the outreach work still is done by volunteers, right? Of course, we can talk about whether that's a good or bad thing. But the point I'm making is that in one of the sessions where I had to pitch the study to a group of volunteers with my RA, and then I had to explain it, they challenged me. They said, what if government got hold of the data? What assurances can you give us that none of them will be put in a home? And then one of them said, why do you have to do the study? And I thought that was fantastic, right? That a group of volunteers were, of course, so knowledgeable about the issue, but also so principled and so concerned. I thought that was amazing, right? So I think those are genuine concerns, and I said that the tone of policy has shifted, but the tone of policy is not the same as the legislation, right? We've been talking about this in another context recently, right? We can't say that just because the legislation is dormant, we let it sit, right? Because as long as it's there, it poses a risk of being used by the next person who then sits in that chair. So it cannot be down to individual decision makers to decide on a tone of policy. If policy is changing, then the law has to change.
I think that housing insecurity and income insecurity are closely linked. Sorry, I'm Wai Han from a publishing house. So I think political leaders should adjust their ministerial salaries to use not the top earners only as the standard for their pay. Instead, they should average perhaps the top 3 and the bottom 3 income levels to arrive at their own income. And this will make them work harder at raising the income levels of the cleaners, the security guards, and so on. We know for sure that rental of rooms are sky high. I've been a very bad landlord myself. I just kept the rental rate constant. But if these people had enough income, do you think they want to sleep rough? I don't think so. So you're right, at many levels of government, things have to change. They have to redirect their interests away from the powerful, the economically well-off, to those who really need help. But sad to say, your figures only come up with 1,000-odd homeless. What's their vote count? Nearly 0. Do you think they'll make a great difference in their policies?
Hi, I'm Shamin from Touch. Just now in the report, you mentioned that there were 3 factors, right, that contributed to the pathway of homelessness. The social, the family conflict, the economic about precarious work, and then housing policies. I'm wondering if during your IDI, if you met anyone in homelessness that tried programs, especially with regards to the social and economic factors. And if yes, I wonder if that you have any insights on what didn't work in these programs that maybe social service agencies or any other agencies can step in to even pilot new things.
Hi, Dr. Ng, Prof. Teo. My name is Andre. I am an aide to a member of parliament. In the context of my voluntary work, I come across, the public housing rental supply is a big thing I come across with a lot of residents that come to speak to us. It's a recurring theme that they either cannot qualify because of very tight constraints on incomes, or like per capita, and they have a household where one member is making enough money, but divided by 6 members of the family is not enough, right? And then there's also the other issue of even after they have been approved for rental housing, they wait months or years to actually get allocated a flat. So my question is, did you encounter this in your research that there's a supply constraint in public rental housing? Is this a factor? And if your count is accurate, like only about 1,000 homeless people in Singapore, isn't it just a simple matter of building 5 new rental blocks and that would house all of them?
Hi, I'm Kage. I would like to ask a question regarding methodology because we have the privilege of having 2 researchers here. It does seem that there needs to be an ethical framework that governs this type of research. So could you shed some light into precedents, if you know of any, or imaginative solutions if this research is to be undertaken by public agencies? Thank you very much. Yeah.
Sorry, can you repeat? You say, is there a what framework was it?
Would there be precedents, right, which such research, that are there ethical precedents in conducting them? And if not, maybe you can suggest certain ways forward, because it does seem very critical that the subjects of study are not at threat of the researchers who may not be, say, maybe from maybe if they have certain agenda due to the employ, for example. I'm just wondering about
ethical framework, huh?
Yes.
Thank you. I think because of time, I don't want to hold everyone back. Are there final questions that we can also take together with this four?
Hi, Coco.
Hello.
So we worked before together on finding solutions in the built environment. I am an architect, a designer in Singapore, and I'm quite curious on why are there more people in temporary shelter? Why such change? As you know, my office is in Chinatown, in Chin Swee Estate. I see the same number of people in the street, the same number of homeless. I'm surprised to see that there are more people in temporary shelter. Is it because the design is better, that people are more, they feel more welcome inside? Or is it because during COVID, there was just no possibility to be outside? I shared with you before that during COVID, they were chased away by the ambassador, that they cannot stay in the streets, so they had nowhere to go. Is it because of that they suddenly went into temporary shelter? Or is it because the design of the shelter was so welcoming that they preferred staying there instead of being outside?
Wow, Wai Han's intriguing suggestion. Minister's salaries and income dispersion, to peg it to income dispersion. I thought that's quite clever, but this is perhaps not the platform to discuss ministerial salary policy, but it's an intriguing suggestion. It made me think that well, if we're in the mood for kind of suggestions and reforms, I did think, related to the previous question, I've always thought it might be a good idea to pass responsibility for the homelessness issue to the Ministry of National Development, rather than the Ministry of Social and Family Development, right? So make it a housing issue rather than a social welfare issue. If it's the same people who have to design housing policy and deal with homelessness, then maybe they will design more sympathetic and reasonable housing policies, right? And I'm sure my MSF colleagues would be supportive of that idea. Right. Vote count is a really sharp observation, which is why some researchers work very hard at public engagements. There are only 1,000 homeless people, but there's so many more concerned members of public, right? So we must continue to do this work, right? Is what I would say. But very sharp observation. Social services, what can they, how can they better help people who face housing insecurity? I think that different parties in this picture have different strengths. Volunteers are excellent for doing outreach work because they're so non-threatening, and they can say we are not professional social workers trying to enroll you into a scheme or bring you into our center. We're certainly not public employees, and all that would be true. They really are volunteers, right? That's their great strength. Professional social workers, I think the great strength is to address maybe difficulties in family relationships. But at the same time, I always point out that there are many things, there are many parts of this picture. Economic precarity and the lack of housing options, which require policy change. Right? So yes, we talk about volunteers and social workers, but also we must talk about public policies. Is there a supply constraint in public rental housing? That there is certainly less supply than demand, which is why there is a wait. But I would suggest that the current wait time does not in fact reflect the full actual demand. Because why? Because demand can be calibrated using the eligibility criteria. If I make it very difficult to qualify, I reduce the demand, right? So Singapore's wait times for public rental housing is not high by international standards, but that's because some of the criteria are really quite unreasonable, right? So if I make it so unreasonable that only one person can qualify, then there's no wait, right? So that's an exaggeration, but I think you get the idea. Yes, there is a supply constraint, but we need to think about the eligibility criteria. The observation that if it's just 1,000 people, why is it so difficult to solve the problem? I wonder that often too. 1,000, the homeless, You mentioned it, right? The problem here is of a solvable scale. 1,000 homeless people. Sometimes people say, "What? Give each homeless person a flat. Does that solve the problem?" Then I think, yeah, actually it does, right? It literally does because it's only 1,000 flats. Singapore's public rental housing system already has 64,000 flats. The entire public housing system, the HDB system, has 1 million flats. We cannot have 1,000 more flats. So I don't think that was a kind of I think that's quite a serious proposal. I mean, and what it brings our attention to is that the problem is of a solvable scale. Kage's question about an ethical framework. When we first started on this research, we did take a very close look at how other countries do it. Some of the struggles they face too, which is that often local authorities get involved in doing these counts and they do it in partnership with NGOs. So they ask the same questions because some of them also have laws which could potentially not be in the interest of homeless people's autonomy and choice. So what helps in those circumstances is, as far as I understand the issue, is that if you have done this together for a period of time, if you have a long history of partnership, then there is trust between the agencies that this is the purpose of this exercise. If you want to do enforcement, it cannot be during this occasion. You need to separate. Otherwise, you don't do this. I remember coming across one of the count exercises, I can't remember which country, where the police do it together with NGOs. So they have to be very clear what they are there to do that day, right? And on top of an ethical framework, I think part of the ethical framework must involve people being very clear about their mandate for the day and the purpose of the exercise. Our challenge is, of course, we haven't yet had this long runway to build trust. The study has not yet been done by public agencies, right? We speak as if it will be, but it has not yet been. And there was a series of quite fascinating articles in the Straits Times, I think it was 2020, that spoke about this change from a time when people were afraid to talk about homelessness because you get into trouble if you say there are homeless people and so on. So what I mean to say is that this anxiety did not come from nowhere, right? It comes from our own track record in dealing with this problem. And in fact, yesterday I was just speaking to a journalist friend. I said, today we're launching this report. And she said, oh, on homelessness, isn't that sensitive? Then I said, I don't know, you tell me, is it? Right? So I suppose we need more time to build trust. And in the first few years, especially the first few times we do this study, I suggest that it must be watched very, very closely for people who are interested in the issue. Watch it closely. If you have concerns, then you must make yourselves heard. Right? I think this issue now is such a shared and collective issue. It's no longer one researcher's issue or one research team's issue. It's a very widely shared issue. Right? So that is the body, the larger public, as you put it, that must hold state agencies to account.
If I say something, will you say something? Because I don't want to have the last word.
Okay, I'll say something.
I want to say two brief things. One is to direct your attention, other than the two excellent reports which you must read tonight, that Kok Ho also wrote a chapter in a UN Habitat report on housing in Singapore and a chapter on social housing, which touches on some of the questions that have been raised here. And one issue that he talks about in that chapter is about how, if you look at our social housing, our public rental housing criteria, it has nothing to do with housing needs. All the criteria has to do with family form or income, but nothing to assess people's actual housing needs. And that is not the only way to assess who needs or who should have access to social housing. Second, he tracks the historical changes in our housing policies over the last couple of decades to show kind of the ebbs and flows and shifts in thinking about what housing is for in a country and what it's meant to represent about who belongs, who deserves, and what public resources should be used for. And I think that tracking is very important because it also shows that none of the conditions we find ourselves in are inevitable. They are decisions that society makes and that politicians make, and they can be changed, as Kok Ho has emphasized a few times. So I would highly recommend you look at that chapter in addition to these two reports for that context. And then the other thing I would say that I think we haven't mentioned so much, but is also important, is that we're talking a lot about housing and the inability to meet this very basic need today. But obviously, people who cannot meet housing needs also cannot meet many, many other basic human needs, right? And we saw in some of the interviews references to food, right? Very basic ability to just not be hungry, right? Is already is also an unmet need for people who are not able to meet housing needs, and many other basic human needs for clothing, for security, for social belonging, for participation in society, for work, for dignity. All of these things are embroidered in that, and I think that's what is at stake here and in this work.
Thanks a lot, Yu-Yen. So I will say that if I know something, which is I forgot to answer Jan's question, so that fits very nicely. So why were so many people going to the shelters? Well, it first started because they were not allowed to be outside. If you remember, during the circuit breaker, you were only supposed to go out to buy food. You weren't even supposed to hang out outside, right? So it was unlawful at one point to be rough sleeping, so to speak. Not because you were rough sleeping, but because you were outside. And many of the interviewees told us they were quite concerned about their own health at the time. We all were wondering, we were worried about this strange global pandemic. So many of them wanted to go in for safety and not to breach, as well as not to breach public regulations about being in public spaces. And at the same time, capacity increased. So demand increased, but so was the availability of space. So that happened. Your question about whether it was because the environment in the shelters was so attractive, there was a range of experiences within the shelters. We don't focus on this in the report, but some of them found that, they had a roof over their head. They had, two of their meals, not all of their meals, and later on one meal catered for. So some of the basic needs, they had access to toilet. They could wash, right? The things that many people take for granted. So they appreciated that. But again, they also struggled with some other arrangements, again, co-living and so on. So it was certainly not because, not primarily because they liked the surroundings that they moved in. It was this kind of larger set of circumstances, right? That is, I'm afraid, all we have time for. Thank you all for your patience. But before we leave, and let you do those 3 readings that Yu-Yen has assigned.
Okay, this brings us to the end of the launch of the Social Inclusion Project's research report, Seeking Shelter Homeless During the COVID-19 Pandemic. Thank you once again, Professor Teo, for joining our event today, and to all of you, our audience, for being here, for staying over time. I know we've run over a little bit, and making this event possible. The full report is now live on the SIP webpage. So we will leave this URL as well as the QR code up on the screen so that you can access it easily. Please do share it with friends and colleagues, and do look out for more discussions of the study on our school's social media in the coming weeks. Members of our team will be happy to help you access the full report online if you have any issues accessing it via the QR code. We have also printed a limited number of copies of the executive summary in the report, which you can pick up at the registration desk on your way out. And do look out for other events here at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. We look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you once again. Take care and stay safe.